Let me just mention that I am a master gardener, and master gardeners are we're an extension of the Penn State Agricultural Extension. So we're a branch, rather, I should say. And master gardeners are selected based on certain qualifications, and then we are educated. And once we pass a rather comprehensive exam, we are qualified to volunteer. And in fact, we're required to volunteer. One of the areas in which I volunteer is education, because it's a natural for me, because I'm a nurse educator by profession. And poison ivy has always been somewhat of a fascination for me. And years ago, I set out to try to answer some personal questions about poison ivy, and I am happy to share with you today what I have discovered. In today's session, the objectives, I'm just going to read them. Describe the notable characteristics of poison ivy, poison oak, and poison sumac so that you can recognize them. Display the distribution of these in our area. Explain the botanical link between poison ivy and plants that have similar allergic potential. I'm going to describe a little bit about the pathophysiology of a poison ivy reaction, and then lastly address some myths about poison ivy. And along the way, it's not an objective, but I'm also going to describe to you how you can control it and the best way for control. This lovely diagram shows you poison ivy, poison oak, and poison sumac. Poison ivy is prevalent throughout all of Pennsylvania. And in fact, I can't say for sure, but I think it is found in every state in the United States. Poison oak is slightly different in that it has some serrated lobes here, but it is still a three-leafed poison. So poison ivy here, poison oak here. Can I just ask, can you see my cursor? Can anybody tell me if you can see my cursor? Because I don't see a way to do a
we can see it, Priscilla.
Okay, good. Poison sumac is this center structure. The thing about poison sumac, though, it is found primarily in swamps and bogs, and you're not likely to be working in swamps or bogs. So it's not something that you have to be terribly concerned about. So the leaves of three adage is pretty pertinent to both poison oak and poison ivy. There are some other biologically related allergens or plants with allergic potential. Cashews, and it so happens my son is allergic to cashews. Pistachios can create an allergic reaction, and obviously these are more of a GI or an oral cavity thing. Mangoes, and it seems to be the skin of mangoes that has allergic potential, and often people who are allergic to mangoes will get a rash around the mouth. And lastly, purple smoke bush, Cottonus coccygeria, and here's a picture of the purple smoke bush. I at one time had 2 purple smoke bushes and never had any problem with them. And so I can't really give you more information about this. I suppose it's a situation where some people do react to touching the purple smoke bush. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what exactly it is in the leaves that creates the problem. The cost of these poisons is huge, particularly in the forestry industry, where the burning poison ivy or poison oak aerosolizes the oils into the smoke. And when people inhale this smoke, they can have a severe systemic allergic reaction. About 1/3 of the workers in the forestry industry, the workers who fight fires, experience a poison reaction every season. And that is very significant, loss of time and budget wise. The epidemiology, and just let me say that this is all a prelude to describing exactly what happens with the poison ivy reaction, what happens in terms of pathophysiology. But there is so much confusion about who gets poison ivy, who doesn't get poison ivy. And clearly, it most commonly affects children because children are outside running around, hopefully, in wooded areas and even in gardens where poison ivy can be found. Infants may not be as easily sensitized as adults, but they're typically not going to be, hopefully, crawling around in areas where there would be poison ivy. Here is the telling statistic. About 10 to 15% of the population is tolerant to poison ivy, meaning they won't get it. And I don't like to use the term immune to poison ivy because poison ivy is an immune reaction, but about 10 to 15% of the population, for reasons that I've not researched and I haven't come across, these people do not get poison ivy. They can work in it, they can pull it out, and they don't react. So obviously, that is a huge advantage for anybody who wants to eliminate poison ivy from their property. The culprit in a poison ivy reaction is called urushiol. It is an oil and it's found in the leaves, most commonly in the summer, but also in the stems, the roots, and the skin of the berries. It dries very quickly on surfaces, and vectors can bring it to you, like your beloved pets. And urushiol oil seems to keep its antigenic or allergenic potential pretty much indefinitely. So even in winter, one can have a poison ivy reaction from touching inadvertently the stems. And as you can see in this diagram, poison ivy frequently grows up tree trunks. It sends out little hair roots that attach to the tree trunks, and there are no leaves to identify it as poison ivy, and it would be very easy to touch something like this while exploring. So the stems and the roots, one's not likely to be digging around at the roots, but definitely the stems contain this urushiol oil. A little bit about the pathophysiology, and don't you love this diagram where somebody tattooed a dragonfly on the skin with the urushiol oil, and here's the allergic reaction. Great graphic. Here's a little bit about the pathophysiology and what happens. Now, let me hasten to say that the first time or two that somebody encounters poison ivy, they will not react. Typically, it is the third time that somebody encounters poison ivy, and then subsequently that there is a reaction. Now, I told you that 10 to 15% of our population does not react to poison ivy, although I've heard anecdotes of people who have, for 30 years have not reacted, and then they all of a sudden get a poison ivy reaction. So you can educate people around you to that effect. They'll say, well, I know I touched poison ivy and I didn't get it, so I must not get poison ivy. And the point is that how many times have they touched it? The first time, and then subsequent times too, this is what happens. This urushiol oil, which is also known in pathophysiology as a hapten, penetrates the skin, and it is a very persistent oil that will cling to the skin, and even after vigorous washing and removal, and apparently for quite some period of time, this oil can still be found in the skin. It penetrates the skin and then it binds onto the cell membranes of macrophages in the dermis. And if you remember, the macrophages are the first step in an immune reaction. Macrophages internalize and, in quotations, eat the antigen, which is urushiol oil. And here in this little diagram, you'll see that happening. This purple structure would represent urushiol oil, and here's a macrophage engulfing this urushiol oil. And everyday speak says that macrophages make it more tasty and then present it to CD4 lymphocytes. So CD4s are the T helper lymphocytes, and these lymphocytes are typically found in the lymph nodes. Then, subsequently, when a person comes in contact with the urushiol oil, these CD4 cells proliferate and they result in a cell-mediated cytotoxic response. And that is the blisters and the rash and the itching. It's a severe type 4 hypersensitivity, delayed hypersensitivity. Obviously we nurses are interested, at least I am. I love pathophysiology. I'm very interested in how this all works. But the take-home message for other people is that it's a delayed response. I'll just mention here, because I don't mention it anywhere else in the presentation, that it is possible to sort of outgrow a poison ivy response. I think I may have outgrown it. I'm very careful around poison ivy and I know how to recognize it quickly, but I haven't had a reaction for a long time. And over time, there's a desensitization process that can happen. So you might talk to people older people typically, who will say, I don't get poison ivy anymore. And that is physiologically possible. Or blister. This destruction of epidermal cells results in vesicles, which are the medical term for blisters. And there's edema, erythema, and intense itching. I think that is the component that bothers people the most. Here's another graphic showing another horrible picture. And when these blisters pop, there can be a bacterial secondary infection just because there is so much opening of the epidermis. Delay between exposure and the appearance of these skin lesions is about a day, or a day, 1 or 2 days. The interesting thing about poison ivy is that it does not spread. And I feel quite sure that some of you will beg to differ. And the last time I had poison ivy, I got it on my arms because I turned my son's pants right side out. He had been out in the woods and the oil was on his pants. I got it up and down my arms. And then I got it later, I mean, a week or so later, on the inner aspect of my thighs. And everything I've read says that it is not spread systemically, but rather the oils tend to persist in the epidermis and the dermis. And perhaps I touched my inner thighs with my arms. I don't really know. I'm just going to say that the literature I've read says that it doesn't spread. And if it pops up in other parts of the body, it is supposedly because of persistent urushiol oil in the skin. Be sure to remember that reservoirs for exposure can be clothing, tools, equipment, pets, and all of these things are known as vectors, meaning that they can spread something that causes a disease or a disorder. Also, bear in mind that lesions can appear on the genitalia, and that would be from performing personal care, wiping with fingers that have urushiol oil on them. So I would teach anybody who has an outbreak involving hands that they should be particularly careful and possibly wear gloves when they wipe themselves, because it is difficult to remove this oil. Also, mucous membranes, such as in the peritoneum, have a very thin stratum corneum, which is the outer epidermal layer, and hands have a thicker stratum corneum. So the hands may not show an outbreak or a lesion, but the genitalia could, from coming in contact with some oil that just happens to be sticking around. Treatment. Lots of over-the-counter treatments can be used. Antihistamines are useful. Benadryl, of course, is very good, but it can cause drowsiness. Corticosteroids suppress the allergic reaction, and you can get over-the-counter steroids, which steroid cortisone cream, which will help to make the itching less intense. My suggestion is that if it is a significant outbreak, it's worth a trip to the physician, who is likely to prescribe either a prescription strength hydrocortisone cream or even a tapering dose of oral steroids. They need to be taken exactly as prescribed. It's important that the dose be tapered because, as you know, the adrenal glands are very sensitive to feedback of the amount of glucocorticoids in the system, and the adrenal glands have to gradually get accustomed, sort of wake up, if you will, after steroids have been administered. So the tapering dose is really important. It is possible for the rash to sort of recur after the steroid is discontinued. I wish that I would have taken time to go and see a physician the last time I had a reaction and gotten oral steroids. You will hear other remedies, oatmeal baths, baking soda, numerous over-the-counter remedies, and home remedies may be very useful and may provide a soothing effect. Obviously, prevention is best. Desensitization is ineffective either through chewing leaves or by shots, although research is ongoing. That was the latest that I found, and I cannot promise you that you won't come across something that research that is showing that there is desensitization possible. Now, this is a little bit ironic because I have told you that it is possible to get to a point in life when the allergy is outgrown, so to speak. Obviously, avoiding it and using clothing barriers is best. And I'm going to show you some pictures of some tiny little poison ivy seedlings and how to recognize them. It's really important to know if you have poison ivy in your yard where a pet may be roaming. Also, apparently, urushiol can penetrate latex, but not rubber gloves. And I wear garden gloves always, but when I am removing poison ivy, I also put 2 plastic bags over my gloves, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. There are some lotions like Ivy Block, which provide a barrier. I have not tried them, and I've not really researched them in depth to know how well they work. Just checking time here, 35 minutes. I like this little graphic, and I'm going to just read through it and comment on some of these adages, which might be useful in helping you to remember poison ivy. I think you all know leaves of 3, let it be. It's an old rhyme referring to the grouping of these 3 leaves. There are other seedlings with 3 leaves, and I've learned how to examine them closely so I know if it's poison ivy or not. And I will say the one that looks the closest is a maple seed. A maple tree, when it is just sprouting, might look a little 3-leaf dish, but most of the time, in my experience, anyway, in my yard, if it has 3 leaves, I treat it with suspicion. Berries white, run in fright. Berries white, danger in sight. I have never seen poison ivy berries, but I know they exist, and they're little white berries like you see here. What happens is that the birds love them, and then the birds sit in trees and poop, and wherever a poison ivy seed lands after having gone through the bird's GI tract, it can sprout. Interestingly, I have some bird feeders outside a window, which is on the 2nd story, and the birds would sit in a tree and wait to come into the feeders. And the next spring, I must have removed 50 poison ivy seedlings from that bed, where apparently this exactly had happened. Red leaflets in spring, it's a dangerous thing. And that refers to the fact that the leaflets are red when they first emerge. And this would be on a plant that has existed for several years, but also on the seedlings. When the seedlings sprout for the first year, they're tiny little structures with 3 red leaves. And let me also mention that sometimes the stems are a reddish color. The stems of poison ivy are a reddish color. This one I don't understand. If butterflies land there, don't put your hand there. And I've never seen butterflies on poison ivy leaves, so I'm not quite sure about that, but I'm going to guess that in some areas of the country where they have some of this species of butterfly, I don't know what it is, this butterfly is attracted to poison ivy for some reason. Hairy vine, no friend of mine, or raggedy rope, don't be a dope. And that refers to the fact that poison ivy can grow up a tree and it has these root extensions or hairs that fasten it onto the tree trunk. So if you see a vine, any vine going up a tree in the winter where you can't see the leaves, you need to be very careful. But particularly if it has hair on it. Longer middle stem, stay away from them. And that just refers to the fact that this stem here in the middle is a little bit longer. And then lastly, side leaflets like mittens will itch like the dickens. And this particular poison ivy leaf looks a bit like a mitten shape. And that just goes to show that there is some variation in the structure of the leaves. Typically, it's 3 leaves, but this one looks like mittens, this one doesn't. Poison oak has more of a serrated leaf edge. Obviously, it's very important for you to know poison ivy and recognize it and suspect it when you are working out in your flower beds, because just because it wasn't there last year doesn't mean that it won't be there this year. And this shows a poison ivy plant as it is emerging in the spring. And you've seen pictures, photos of the vines growing up trees. Start noticing that. I pay attention to this as I'm driving along, and whenever there is a massive vine growing up a tree, it's likely to be poison ivy. There is also Virginia creeper, which is a very useful and desired vine, but it has 5 leaves, not 3. These are a couple of photos I took. Take a look here. I have ferns, and I'm likely to be working amidst my ferns, and right there is a poison ivy plant. And as I'm working outside, I'm constantly looking carefully and obviously identifying weeds versus desired plants, but looking also for poison ivy. And then this one, I actually put a little dialogue box there. Look, I'm right here next to the hose you're about to take apart. And so if I didn't have gloves on and I had my hands down there taking this hose apart, I could easily brush against this itty bitty seedling and cause myself a lot of grief. A question: how long is urushiol potent? I read one study when I was updating for this presentation where pieces of poison ivy were dried, crushed, washed, and drowned, and still found to be a potent source of urushiol even after a year and a half. So you can see in this photo that there are dead poison ivy leaves, and if you are walking in the woods in the fall or the winter, you might not recognize them as such, but they still have allergic potential. Does poison ivy have any value? And I would guess that you are one of many people who are very interested in native plants and preservation of our ecosystems and so forth. So is there any value? And yes, there is. Most wildlife is not sensitive to poison ivy, and you can see here a deer about ready to browse on poison ivy. Birds also eat the berries, rabbits feed on the twigs, and pollinators can visit the flowers. Here is a photo of some of the flowers and then a photo of some of the berries. As I said, I have never seen these flowers and berries. I'm sure I will someday. And here's a lovely picture of a downy woodpecker eating these berries in the winter. You can see there's no foliage, but a cluster of berries. And clearly, our birds are dependent on berries in the winter. I just listed here, if you happen to be a bird lover, some of the species of birds that will eat the berries. And those are the eastern bluebird, the dark-eyed junco, Carolina chickadee, Carolina wren, and woodpeckers. Removal. My practice is this. I always wear garden gloves to begin with. And when I see poison ivy, I put 2 plastic bags over my gloves and I turn them back so that my fingers can pull the poison ivy out. And then I pull the plastic bags over the poison ivy. Or alternately, I have learned how to dig it out, but it should be disposed of in the trash. And I'll get to that in a moment. Do not burn poison ivy because inhalation of the smoke, as I mentioned, can cause a very serious allergic reaction in the airways. Do not compost poison ivy. And I was guilty of this before I knew what poison ivy was. I would just have it in my bucket of weeds, and the weeds got composted or taken back to our township composting facility. The vines may be large and should be shredded before they could be composted. And obviously shredding of vines is very ill-advised because that could aerosolize the oil. The length of time that this urushiol oil is active is unknown. And that's because research is ongoing. You could bury poison ivy, but it obviously has some limitations, just saying. Probably the best method of disposal is to spray. And yes, I know we know that Roundup is carcinogenic. So if you have to do it, you have to do it with extreme caution. And, here, I'm just going to go through some steps that you could take. Spray poison ivy with Roundup Plus Tough Brush Killer. When dead, it can be removed with gloves, eyewear, and clothing that covers all the skin. Just know that because you have killed the poison ivy with Roundup, doesn't mean that you can't get an allergic reaction. You can get an allergic reaction. The reason for spraying with Roundup would be to just get rid of the foliage and make the vine more manageable in terms of removing it. All poison ivy then should be bagged in a garbage bag and it would be a good idea to dispose of the gloves, and then put the bag, the tightly closed bag, in the trash. And so somebody asked me once, well, our trash, at least in Lancaster County where I am, is incinerated, and isn't that a problem? And I've never read anything about that, and to the best of my knowledge, it's not a problem, because it would be such a small component of any gases that are released from incineration. If you know that you've been dealing with poison ivy, you may want to wear old clothes and simply dispose of them, or you can wash them separately in warm soapy water, which, as far as I know from the research, will remove the urushiol oil. This is a great handout, and I put it in the chat box, but I'm just going to take you there to take a look at it, because it summarizes what I have said and even more. Well, I tried this earlier and it worked. There we go. I think it is Texas. I think this is a handout that was produced in Texas. And I'm just going to scroll down through. It talks a little bit about much of what I have said. Here are some myths, which essentially I have addressed. Urushiol oil is potent, we know that. Here is something that I did not address, but I think it bears addressing. And that is, if you know that you have been, I thought it was here. Oh, here it is. If you know you've been in contact with poison ivy, it was accidental, you were weeding and you pulled something out, and after you touched it, you realized it was poison ivy, you should cleanse the exposed skin with generous amounts of alcohol, rubbing alcohol. This will remove the protective coating on your skin, the oily coating that naturally occurs on the skin, but then it will also remove the urushiol oil, and then wash the exposed skin. After you've done that, you can shower with soap and water. And it says here, do not use soap.
I'm sorry to interrupt. The screen did not change for me, and I don't think it changed for everybody.
Oh, sorry.
I still see the click here, and I put it in the chat, and I thought it was my computer at first.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm just going to finish what it says here, and then I'll click. And you
Sorry for the interruption.
You can pursue this. No, thank you for letting me know. That does sometimes happen, and I don't know. I probably would have to share a new screen.
Yeah.
Anyway, cleanse with alcohol first, and then soap and water. That's the bottom line message. And then this handout goes over a lot of things that I have gone over. Okay. I'm going to just go through a few slides here, and then I will open it up for discussion. If you have any questions about poison ivy or any other gardening questions, Master Gardeners are here to help. And you can call, this is the Lancaster number, but if you are in another county, you can look up the number for your county. You call the extension number here, and you will reach a hotline, which is staffed, excuse me. Or you can email your question. You can send photos, and you will get a response rather quickly from a master gardener who is there to help you with all of your gardening needs. Let me just say also that we have a couple of upcoming events in Lancaster County, and that is that on Saturday, April 15th, there is a webinar that will help you with growing berries in your backyard. And then on May 6th, the Master Gardeners are sponsoring a huge plant sale. This is Lancaster County, but I think every county has a plant sale. If you're interested, you can go to the plant sale and you can compete with other people to get some very carefully chosen plants for your precious backyard. I'm on the plant sale committee, so I know that just countless hours go into this. And all of this work is to raise funds that support the other educational activities that we participate in. Okay, I am now finished with the formal part of the presentation.